So, David, today we're talking about 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul deals with a number of questions apparently that have been proposed to him about marriage. Who should get married and when and why and whether it's okay. He starts out, though, on a really odd note. He says, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is well for a man not to touch a woman." Where is this coming from?
Yes, I assume that at this point he begins to quote a letter that they've given him. He says, concerning the things about which you wrote. And scholars who I respect have said that there's a little clue in the rest of the letter that whenever he uses the little Greek phrase perida, which means now concerning, that he's bringing up a topic that came to him in their letter. And therefore, it seems to me quite likely that one of the things they wrote to him said, "Dear Paul, here's our thought. It is well for a man not to touch a woman. What do you think?" And my supposition, I want to have you check me out on this, but my supposition on this is that in this strong sense that Paul has shared with them, that the kingdom is beginning to break in upon them and will reach its consummation very soon, that they are to live as faithful people. And some have thought, all right, what would it mean to live as a faithful person in the light of the fact that the world is coming to an end? And we've already noticed that these people are a little suspicious about the physical, about the sexual, about the embodiment of the human life. So maybe they're saying, all right, here's a plan. In order to be sure we're faithful at the end of time, why don't, I say to my spouse, why don't you and I just refrain from sexual intercourse in the meantime till Jesus comes again? It is well for a man not to touch a woman. Touch doesn't mean touch. It's clearly a sense that this is intercourse between the two people. And some of them are saying, here's a good plan. Let's simply not have intercourse because Jesus is coming again soon. And Paul disagrees with that.
You know, we talked about angels, I think, in our last conversation. And a little later on in Christian history, we have the notion of the angelic life, which is the celibate life.
Yeah.
And there may be hints of that going on already here in the first century, some sort of...
Well, in Jesus' own word, that angels neither marry nor are given in marriage.
That's right.
And if these are people who in chapter 13 are speaking in angelic tongues, maybe they're trying to lead angelic sexual lives as well, which is simply to refrain from marriage with each other.
So this would all fit with this notion of spirituality that seems to be...
A deep spirituality that forgets how embodied we still all are and need to be, how embodied we appropriately are.
Mm-hmm. It may be something coming out of the Greek and Roman heritage of this congregation that has a deep suspicion of the body, at least in some of its strands.
That the soul, in some of its strands, the way that we protect the soul is simply not to get engaged with the impediments of the body like sex. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Paul's smart about this, I think. I have never used this at a wedding ceremony because I think on the whole his understanding of marriage is a little anti-romantic or pre-romantic or non-romantic. But there's some wisdom in all this. Partly he has an extraordinarily practical word, which is that the danger of that is if my spouse and I say we're not going to have sex with each other, then the temptation will be for one of us loosening up on our marriage vows to have sex with somebody else.
Especially if all things are lawful.
Especially if all things are lawful. This could be perfect permission for me to say, all right, dear, in relationship to you, I'm being extraordinarily chaste, but then there's the rest of the world out there. Not good for marital relations in that day any more than for this one. But there's also a deeper thing all the way through, which is his strong sense that given the fact that Christ is coming again and that we live at the dawning of a new age, that all things considered, and the all things considered is very important, it is best for people to remain as they are, which is to say widowers should stay unmarried if they can. Widows should stay unmarried if they can. We'll come back to the odd word about virgins and who they're supposed to be. Married people should continue in their marriage for the most part. We'll come back to that as well. Because what's the point of making radical changes in your life when you are living at the dawn of a brand new age?
When the shape of this world is passing away.
The shape of this world is passing away.
Yep.
It's becoming a brand new world.
Verse 31. What about the issue of divorce? Now, that's something that Paul tackles here.
That is tricky, right? And I want your help on contemporary application of that. The two interesting things about that. One is this is one of the few places where he goes back to the words of Jesus, where he seems to know the tradition that we get in Mark and Matthew, at least, about the fact that divorced people are not supposed to remarry within the light of the Christian church, and he holds that up as a word of the Lord. The major exception he makes, and this includes people, if my spouse is a believer and I'm an unbeliever, even that doesn't necessarily give her permission to divorce me unless I want to be divorced. That on the whole, and I know I'm running through too many things here, but so let me slow it down. If our faith is embodied, if my Christianity let's say I'm the believer and she's the unbeliever. If my Christianity is embodied, then interestingly, when we have intercourse, it's not that she profanes me, but that I may sanctify her. That the me that I bring to her is the sanctified me, the saintly me. And in that sense, our relationship to each other, however implicitly, is also sanctifying her. That's a very powerful sense of the importance of embodiment. So that even in that case, we shouldn't get divorced. The tricky place is where there's an unbeliever who wants to divorce a believer. And at that point, that seems to be permitted, which you've got some thoughts about how that's worked out in Catholic morality.
Right. This is the so-called Pauline privilege. This is one of these cases where a biblical injunction or admonition becomes the basis for a legal tradition.
Okay.
And in general, divorce is prohibited by the Catholic Church,
Yeah.
but there is one exception, and the exception is the one embedded in Scripture right here. That is, if two people are married and one is a non-believer and the non-believer wishes to separate, the believer is free to remarry. It's not a question of annulment, it's just a question of Paul's exception.
Yeah.
And I think what's very interesting about this is that Paul knows a tradition of the sayings of Jesus, and he knows this is a command of Jesus, and he's willing to make an exception.
Yeah, yeah.
So even
Very
on
interesting.
this, he's
Very
pragmatic
interesting. Very
and
interesting.
flexible
Yeah, very
and
interesting.
pastoral.
Yeah.
There are certain firm lines that he's willing to draw, and certain important traditions that he has from Jesus. But he
With
has
a
to
little
adapt
with a
them.
little wobble room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, I think
no,
that's
that's very
exactly
interesting.
right. And related to that, just his strong sense that once again, what we do with our bodies is very important for who we are. And how we relate to each other. The place where it gets extremely unromantic is that he says, for those of us who are widows or widowers, that it's better not to marry, but if we simply, the old line is, it's better to marry than burn, which I've often said was not the best way to start a wedding homily. Now, dear sister and brother in Christ, it's better to marry than burn, so let's go ahead with these vows. But it's his pragmatic, all right, if he had his choice, he'd have all widowers be celibate as he is, but the truth is some people have a hard time with that, so go ahead and get married.
Right. Now, there's another issue that he brings up here. Under his general rubric of staying as you are, he introduces the issue of slavery.
Yeah.
And it sort of pops up in the middle of this.
It is. It's not the main
of,
thing we think he's saying.
Of sexual and marital issues, but what do you make of his advice there in chapter 7, verse 21 and following?
Well, as you point out, chapter 20 pointed out to me earlier that chapter 21 is a little bit tricky, and let me just read to you the two different ways it can go. Yeah, chapter 7, verse 21. Were you a slave when called? Do not be concerned about it, even if you can gain your freedom. And then one translation says, make use of your present condition now more than ever, which makes it sound like I'm your slave, you offer me freedom, and I say, no, I'm going to make use of my present condition now more than ever, which means I'll stick around, you be master, I'll be slave, and I'll probably try to win you to Christ by my slave-like docility.
Right. That, by the way, would be in conformity with the general advice he's giving here.
Very much. Stay as you are. Stay as you are.
And it would also, interestingly enough, mirror what goes on in Greco-Roman philosophy, where slavery was viewed as indifferent to the true spiritual interior self.
And very much founds the kind of stuff we find in 1 Peter and some later Christian writing, where the assumption always is, slaves, be obedient to your masters. Don't stir it up. Don't mess it up. The alternative translation of exactly the same words would be this: were you a slave when called? Do not be concerned about it. Even if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself now more than ever, which makes it sound like, all right, if in this exceptional case the presumably believing owner wants to set you free, then go for it. This is very tricky because one of the things I always remember is Howard Thurman, who was a great African-American religious thinker of the middle of the 20th century, writing about his grandmother when teaching him the Bible when he was growing up, and she loved to read him the Gospels, and she told him never to read Paul, because Paul was the one who told all those masters that they should own their slaves and the slaves shouldn't rebel, and that's what had been so much trouble for her people for all those years. So he could love the Bible and he could love Jesus, but he couldn't love Paul. And we know from excellent studies that slavery in that time was not like slavery in the antebellum South. On the other hand, for people whose ancestors have been slaves in the not too distant past, it's very hard to read these words and not in the traditional reading and not find them oppressive, I think.
This is another one of those cases where I think there's probably a tradition that grows within Christianity that's more adapted to the general social norms of the Greco-Roman world, and that Paul was probably a little more radical,
Okay.
as he was also on issues of women in leadership roles. And my hunch is that that alternative reading that you've given us, avail yourself of the opportunity, is what he actually
You do?
said.
Interesting,
Yeah.
okay.
And why? Because again, it conforms to his overarching concern to have the principles embodied. And so I think he's probably here resisting the kind of stoic or philosophical move, saying slavery is indifferent. It's the internal spiritual freedom that we're looking for. No, I think he's saying here,
The body counts.
the body counts.
The social
That's right.
condition counts. That's who you are. Wish he'd said it louder.
I wish so too. I wish so too.
Yeah. I wanted to circle back on the Roman Catholic business about the Pauline privilege. It's part of what we were talking about on sexual ethics before. In the Protestant church, the difference I've seen in my years, which are now many, is that when I was a boy growing up in the Protestant parish with a Protestant preacher father, very much a mainline church, if a Presbyterian or an Episcopal or an American Baptist or a UCC pastor divorced, that was it. They weren't burned, they weren't banned, but the pastorate was over. That was no longer an option because the very clear word from both Paul and from Jesus was not divorce except in the case of an unbeliever letting go an unbeliever, and an unbeliever letting go a believer. And this was two believers divorcing, and that was the end of the pastorate. Remarkable change, at least in the churches where I now serve, where numbers of people have divorced and remarried and are able sometimes to keep even the same parish where they were before. And along with that, much more freedom for lay people not to get deeply concerned with that. And I don't know any mainline Protestant pastor who as a rule, there are exceptions, who as a rule will never remarry divorced people. I don't know anybody who does that, and that's over the last 40 years or so. How do we interpret Paul for a world where I don't think we've even bothered to figure out what the Pauline privilege is on this. We've just said that's not the way the world goes. Let's move on.
Well, I think the one inspiration I could take from Paul is what he does with the command of Jesus.
Okay.
That there are teachings from which we can learn, that we have to adapt.
Yeah,
We have to be able to apply them.
Yeah, that's very powerful. So that what I've used in here is the distinction he makes between a word from the Lord and his own opinions of the faithful person, and that he's willing to start with the word from the Lord and then also say, nonetheless, as a faithful person.
It's not necessarily the final word.
It's not necessarily the final word. Flipping it around, I would say, and I say this as one who has frequently presided at the marriage ceremonies of people who have been divorced, and the Christian right drives me bonkers in a whole number of ways. I do think that the shift from I now take you to be my spouse as long as we both shall live to I take you to be my spouse as long as we both feel like it is not necessarily good news for embodied Christianity. That part of what we see in embodied Christianity is this sense that fidelity does matter, and that fidelity matters for the long term even when it's hard.
I think Paul would agree with that.
I think Paul would agree with that.